All right. We are going ahead and beginning the actual presentation, the whole reason you're here. And let me go ahead and introduce our speaker here. Cheryl Mack is an archaeologist and historian living in Trout Lake, Washington. Sorry, not Troutville. She received her master's degree in anthropology from the University of Oregon and began working as an archaeologist in the Columbia River Gorge in 1979, assisting with the salvage excavations at the site of Loch, located near the second powerhouse in the Bonneville Dam. The majority of her career was spent working as an archaeologist for the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Southwest Washington, from which she retired in 2011 after 31 years. So everybody, here is your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And so we are hearing you there, and then this is just for the room audio if they can't hear you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I get it.
It's
Okay. Okay, good evening. Does that sound okay? All right. So between August 8th and August 11th of 1853, a group of 68 men under the command of Brevet Captain George Britton McClellan spent 3 days camped at a place they called Chequoss, or Chequoss, or Chequoss. They had several different names. This camp was located at the crest of the Cascade Mountain Range in what's now the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Southwest Washington. Okay. Advancing. Oh, there we go. Didn't hit it hard enough. So, and just to be clear, this was the same George McClellan who 8 years later would be commander-in-chief of the Northern Army in the Civil War, just so everybody knows that. But in 1853, he was in command of a group of engineers, scientists, soldiers, hunters, and packers, and they were undertaking one of several surveys ordered by the Secretary of War to find a route for a transcontinental railroad. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a location here to show you where we are. So we're right here. Is that showing up as red on there? Is my point? No, my pointer's not showing up. Okay. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so here we are in Portland. This is, oh boy, not working good as a pointer, but this is the Columbia River. You can see there at the bottom. I don't know how clear this is to you, but you can see Mount St. Helens. And this was the first map actually that showed Mount Adams on it in 1853. And you can see their route kind of vaguely up there, but that's how this terrain was for them. It was all pretty vague. So if you try to actually plot some of these areas here, you would have a hard time figuring out where they actually were, except for the Columbia River. So let me see here. So McClellan, at the age of 26, now he was born in Philadelphia. He had graduated from West Point. So at the age of 26, he was placed in command of the Western Division of the northernmost route of the railroad surveys. Now, there were 4 routes in total that were being surveyed. 3 of these were in California, and 1 was in the Washington Territory. So the territorial governor, Isaac Stevens, he was leading a separate expedition west from St. Paul, Minnesota, and he intended to rendezvous with McClellan in central Washington. So McClellan, for his part, was charged with exploring all of the Cascade passes, basically between the Columbia River and the Canadian border, to find one pass that would take a railroad into the Puget Sound area. So McClellan, using local Native American guides from the vicinity of Fort Vancouver, he left Fort Vancouver on July 18th, and his hope was to pass quickly to the east side of the Cascades, the drier side, where he could explore all of these passes from that side. He was initially going to travel down the Columbia River to the Dalles and go north, but high water on the Columbia made him take an interior route. So he leaves on July 18th, and by August 8th, after having spent 22 days literally chopping their way through western forests, their 173 horses and mules were badly in need of forage and rest. And just so you know, these plates that I'm showing here are actual plates from the Pacific Railroad surveys, most of them from paintings by John McStanley. So McClellan, with the help of Isaac Stevens, had assembled this large and rather cumbersome party over the course of several months. It included 2 officers from the Army's 3rd Artillery. They had been assigned to the expedition by the Army. And this was Lieutenant Johnson Kelly Duncan, who was second in command. He served as astronomer, topographer, and draftsman. And Lieutenant Sylvester Mowry, who served as meteorologist and barometrician. That was a word I'd never heard before, but he was in charge of barometers. And Lieutenant Henry Clay Hodges from the 4th Infantry at Fort Vancouver was assigned as quartermaster. And this expedition wasn't solely concerned with just finding a railroad route, even though this was their primary interest. They also wanted to document everything about this land in the West. And so they hired several civilian scientists to go along with the expeditions in order to document the flora and fauna and the native people who lived here. So on McClellan's expedition, this included Dr. James Graham Cooper, who served as surgeon and naturalist. He was a surgeon by training and a naturalist by inclination. And he was documenting all of the flora and fauna and taking samples of specimens along the way. And then also Dr. George Gibbs, who served as geologist and ethnologist. And he was actually a lawyer by training, but his job was to document information about all the native people that they met. And McClellan had made an interesting request before the expedition started. He asked if he could bring his own assistants with him. And this was somewhat unusual, but Isaac Stevens decided to say yes, because he really wanted McClellan to take on this survey. And so one of the assistants that McClellan brought with him from Texas was a man named Joseph Minter. Now, Minter was a civilian. He served as assistant to the commander and assistant engineer in charge of courses and distances. And this is kind of a little interesting sideline here, but this image that you see here is basically the only image of an expedition member that is known to exist. This is from the first page of Minter's expedition journal. He sketched it in there, he labeled it the Pathfinder. And for many decades now, this has been used as an image of McClellan. So assuming that Minter sketched McClellan as the Pathfinder. And so this was even used in the Washington State Centennial as a standalone image representing the Pacific Railroad surveys. And on the Library of Congress's website today, this is labeled as an image of George McClellan during these surveys. And I have to take issue with that. I think they're wrong for 2 reasons. One of which, I did a fair amount of research into the uniforms that they were wearing at that time, and McClellan would have had 2 choices of what to wear, either a dress uniform or an undress uniform. He would have always been in uniform as a military officer and as commander. And Minter, if I can get back up there, was a civilian, and so he was free to wear whatever he wanted. The other point is that if you look at Minter's beard, officers at that time period in 1853 were required to keep their hair and their beards trimmed. I mean, it was written into the regulations. And it's interesting, McClellan himself was a doodler in his notebooks and his journals. And I believe this is actually a self-portrait that he made in one of his own journals, because it looks pretty much like him in his photos. So as you can see, he had a mustache and a little goatee. So anyway, I don't think that that image is of McClellan. I think it's actually a self-portrait that Minter drew in his journal. So when McClellan arrived at Fort Vancouver, and this was in June, he hired several more expedition members. And one of those was Adolphus Lee Lewis. Now, Lewis had been a clerk and a surveyor with the Hudson's Bay Company, and he served as assistant engineer, guide, and interpreter. He had settled at the mouth of the Lewis River in 1845, and so he provided much needed local knowledge for the expedition. And it's another interesting fact, the Lewis River was actually named after this man, not the other Lewis. And another man that McClellan hired was Andrew Jackson Bolin. And this is a man whose murder 2 years later in 1855, when he served as an Indian agent, would spark the beginning of the Yakima War. But in 1853, he was one of 2 lead packers for the McClellan expedition, the other being John Macomb. And in turn, Bolin and Macomb oversaw 20 civilian packers who were hired for the expedition. So they had a lot of stuff that they carried with them. McClellan also hired 3 hunters, Lount, Mudge, and Taylor. And he had written to Lieutenant Duncan in May saying that based on his experience in Texas, he felt like these hunters could provide the party with enough meat that they could subsist off of pemmican for the entire expedition and not have to eat salt pork. Well, this did not prove to be the case. And in fact, I don't believe these hunters ever shot anything bigger than a grouse. But in spite of that, McClellan kept them on throughout the entire expedition. And so aside from the officers who served as expedition members, Isaac Stevens assigned 28 soldiers from the 4th Infantry at Fort Vancouver to serve as an armed escort to the expedition. This was 2 years before the Yakima War. No treaties had been signed with the tribes they were going to encounter. And so Stevens felt this was a necessary caution. McClellan, with obvious concern for the size of his party, now it's up to 68 men, he assigned several of these men immediately to other duties. One, private use, he assigned to be a blacksmith, and then 6 others he assigned to be additional packers. So now they have over 26 packers. McClellan wrote in his final report, he said, the size of the party may seem too large, but from the nature of what little information we possessed at the time in reference to the country we were to traverse, the disposition of the Indians among whom we were to travel, it seemed that the number was as small as it ought to be. So there was a less than subtle social distinction between members of the party. The officers were referred to by rank in official records. The scientists and the gentlemen were referred to as Mr. And everyone else, the infantry privates, the hunters, the packers, were all simply referred to by their last name. So it's kind of like watching an episode of Downton Abbey. You could tell who everybody was just based on how they were addressed. And an even further distinction was given to the personal servant that McClellan had accompany him. So aside from these assistants that he brought along, he also brought a personal servant, and he was referred to simply as Jim. The Native American guides, who were likely Klickitat Indians from the vicinity of Fort Vancouver, went completely unnamed throughout the expedition. And this expedition did not have a small footprint. Before leaving, McClellan had told Duncan he wanted to order all common tents. So common tents refers to an A-frame wedge tent made out of canvas. And assuming that officers and scientists slept 2 to a tent and everyone else 4, they would have required at least 21 tents each night to accommodate all of these people. And they also had a larger tent for their surveying instruments. The expedition had 127 horses and 46 mules. McClellan had wanted all mules. He had been very specific about that, but he couldn't get them at Fort Vancouver, so he had to put up with horses. But in spite of having horses that he didn't like, they still had to be led to food and water every single day. And they had to be picketed and hobbled at night. So there was a lot of work associated with all of these animals. And 100 of these were pack animals, and 73 were used for the saddle. So these 100 pack animals had to be loaded and unloaded every single day. So the expedition followed a well-established indigenous trail across the Cascades. It's highlighted here in red. And Gibbs referred to this, George Gibbs referred to this in his final report as the Klickitat Trail. And this trail traversed what's now the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, which I have shown here outlined in green, from east to west. And 4 of the expedition's overnight camps were situated on what's now the National Forest. So having worked here on the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest since 1981, I developed what I like to think of as a healthy obsession with the expedition. Read all of the expedition journals, ordered their journals, or excuse me, all of the reports, ordered their journals on microfilm and read them. But still, prior to 1999, none of their camps had been identified archaeologically. The trail, now we knew approximately where they were because they're shown on a map, but we did not identify them, exactly and find any archaeological remains. Now the trail itself, we did identify, and sections of it that were still intact, we had determined eligible to the National Register as a linear feature. So a number of authors have written about the Pacific Railroad surveys and about George McClellan's role in them. And Boyd, Hunn, and Norton wrote about the role that the Klickitat Trail played in the Native economy. But in spite of the attention that this has gotten in the past, none of the expedition's campsites have ever been identified archaeologically, not one of them. So I thought that surely an expedition of this size would have left some kind of an archaeological signature, particularly at those camps where they spent more than one night. Like at Yakult, they spent 4 nights, and at Chequoss, they spent 3 nights. So in order to determine what that archaeological signature would have looked like, I examined the records of the expedition and, to try to find out what they carried with them and what sorts of activities they engaged in. So the records of the expedition are part of the George Brinton McClellan papers at the Library of Congress. And they contain detailed receipts and inventories of everything that the expedition purchased and what they brought along with them. So this includes receipts for items that they purchased in New York and had shipped by steamer through Panama to Fort Vancouver. And these included things like their surveying instruments, which I list here. They brought a sextant, 2 chronometers, level chain staff, a surveyor's compass, Schmalkalder compasses, several types of barometers, hygrometers, which measure humidity, 4 thermometers, and a pedometer. So those are the things they brought with them for surveying. But they also brought with them things like their notebooks, pens, ink, paper, lanterns, scissors, so these are all the kind of things that they bought in New York and shipped out here. And then once they got to Fort Vancouver, they also purchased things from the Hudson's Bay Company store there. And this includes usually things like clothing and food-related items. And most of the clothing was listed as purchases for individuals, and presumably this was deducted from their wages. You see things on here like Blucher shoes, so those must have been the types of shoes they wore in that day, and silk handkerchiefs, those were big. And different types of trousers. And so these were things, because again, they're going to be gone for several months. And so they purchased a large amount of clothing there. And then individuals purchased things like matches, needle and thread, and tobacco. Tobacco was a big one. So they were issued standard Army rations by the quartermaster of Fort Vancouver, who at that time was Ulysses S. Grant. And this is according to McClellan's own notes, it included salt pork, the dreaded salt pork, hardtack or pilot bread. They also brought a flour ration along with them, coffee, beans, rice, salt, vinegar, soap, and candles. And so most of these things would have been carried in barrels or in sacks. And this is part of what's on all of those 100 pack animals that they have. So it's interesting, when you look at the receipts from the Hudson's Bay Company, McClellan purchased what you might call luxury food items before they left. He bought 10 pounds of chocolate. He bought white pepper, black pepper, white sugar. He bought more tobacco. He also bought baking soda. And then he also bought 5 Dutch ovens, 2 frying pans, a kettle. These aren't enough to be for the entire expedition, so I assume that these were simply for the use of the officers who were on the expedition. So a few weeks later, after being at Chequoss, McClellan wrote a letter to his mother describing his dinner, and I'm just going to read this to you because it gives you an example of what they were eating when they were out there. He said, "I am now awaiting my dinner, which, by the way of giving you a glimpse of our fare, will probably consist of the usual routine of salt pork, bread, you'd shudder at it, though it seems good to us, and coffee without sugar. There is no game in these mountains except grouse, and we saw none today. So pork is the order of the day." So interestingly enough, this is an expedition of 68 men. There was no cook on the expedition, even though surely McClellan's personal servant served in that role for the captain. But I learned, especially this was reading Justin Eichelberger's thesis on foodways at Fort Yamhill in the 1850s. He wrote that during the 1850s, the Army did not provide cooks for soldiers in the field. They expected soldiers to both cook and eat their food from a tin plate, a tin cup, and a knife, fork, and a spoon. That was all that was issued to them. And sometimes soldiers would go together in small groups, which they referred to as a mess, and they would purchase something like a frying pan or a kettle that they would use in a small group, but they had to do that personally. The Army did not give this to them. So this is, this cup and plate is what they were issued. So some of the other things they would have had along with them, they would have had a number of things in bottles. They had a lot of medicine bottles, although Dr. Cooper did talk about how these got broken fairly quickly on the backs of mules. And Cooper brought a lot of specimen bottles with him. He was collecting specimens as he went. And he would have carried arsenic and alcohol in some kinds of metal containers for the preservation of these specimens. So sometimes this was carried in things like tea canisters, as you see here. Interestingly enough, though, even though they brought alcohol for the preservation of specimens, there was no rum ration on this expedition. And they also would have had ink bottles with them, and they could have come in a variety of shapes and sizes. So ordnance is a subject unto itself. So these are the guns and ammunition that they had with them. This was considered accountable property. And so McClellan had to personally sign for every single item of ordnance that they brought with them. And he signed for a total of 23 Colt's repeating pistols, 37 percussion rifles, and 5 Sharps carbines. And every one of those guns had very specific tools that went with it. So every one of them had a screwdriver, and that was used to disassemble the gun for cleaning, and then also some kind of a wiper that was used to wipe and oil the barrel, because the powder that they used was very highly corrosive. They also had cartridge boxes. They had bullet molds for round and conical balls. They had powder flasks. They had percussion caps, and these came in little tins, oval tins that had friction lids. So they had a number of things that they carried with them that went along with the ordnance. And you can see the type of cartridge box that I have up here that they probably would have carried. This is called the pattern of 1839 cartridge box. It had a nice brass plate in the front of it with US on it. And it would have had a single tin inside of it that would have held paper cartridges. And they also brought, I didn't mention this, thousands and thousands of paper cartridges along with them. And so when they got back to Fort Vancouver in December, at the end of the expedition, McClellan had to account for all of this. And he had to state what was lost. And so that's at the bottom of this form. This form was completed in December. And he says he lost 1 Colt's pistol, 1 percussion rifle, 25 screwdrivers, 21 wipers, 6 cartridge boxes, and there's just a number of other smaller things that they lost while they were out there. So they did lose a few things. So what did they do while they were out there? Well, all of the expedition members were required to keep a journal, and those that survive include the journals of Captain McClellan, and there are 2 versions of this. One was probably a draft, and these are housed today in the Library of Congress in the George Brinton McClellan papers. And this is another one of those interesting asides, because Isaac Stevens, who was the overall Northern Route commander, had demanded that everyone turn in their journals to him at the end, and McClellan refused. And it's probably because he said not nice things about Stevens in it towards the end, but he refused to turn in his journals. And so that's how they ended up with the George Brinton McClellan papers in the Library of Congress. And then also the journal and field notebooks of Joseph Minter, who served as assistant engineer in charge of courses and distances. So Minter has both a personal journal and then also a notebook full of courses and distances for their entire route. And then between Minter and McClellan both have a number of notebooks for various instrument readings, things like barometers, measuring altitude, things like that. And then there's also the journal of Dr. James Graham Cooper, the surgeon and naturalist. That's housed in the Smithsonian archives. And his is really interesting because not only does it talk about the natural area, the types of plants and animals they saw, but it includes a map, and it's just dispersed throughout it in little sections, and it's almost exactly 1 inch to the mile. It's very faint, and I know you can't see much of it, but it's just an amazing map as to how accurate that it is. The section that I have reproduced here, you can see he puts letters, and they're meant to be pieced together. But yeah, this is the section that has Chequoss at one end. And then George Gibbs, there's several of his notebooks that are in the Yale Library, and these do relate to the expedition, but it's not his personal journal. He has some notes on Indian tribes, and then he has a notebook that has daily barometric readings in it for the expedition. So Chequoss was the 14th camp along the expedition route, and its name was derived, just as all the other names of the camps that they gave, from the native name of the place. And this would have been Chequoss, which means roughly rocky place. And that probably refers to its proximity to what's now known as the Big Lava Bed. So their decision to remain 3 days at Chequoss was probably based on a number of factors. The most important of which is there was grass there, because prior to this, for the 22 days that they were getting here, there was very little grass for their animals, and their horses and mules suffered greatly. And so when they got up to the crest of the Cascade Range, they all commented on how there was just abundant grass everywhere. Now, McClellan himself wrote in his journal, "We remained at this place to recruit the animals and try to regulate the chronometers." So this is a reminder, they are navigating by the stars. And so when they are up here at the crest of the Cascade Range, they have peaks nearby where they can take needed celestial readings. And this is an interesting sketch in one of McClellan's notebooks. This is his observations of double altitudes. But he sketched someone holding a sextant, and you see the North Star indicated there, and he labeled it stargazing. So the quartermaster, Henry Clay Hodges, Lieutenant Henry Clay Hodges, is the only person I'm aware of who was interviewed in his later life about the expedition. He was asked in 1908 by the Washington State Historical Society to provide a summary of the expedition. And so he wrote a detailed letter back to them about it. And he said, "We left Fort Vancouver, now Vancouver Barracks, early in July 1853. And by hard work, we arrived at the top of the Cascade Mountains at a place called Chequoss. The Klickitat River rises near this place." No, it doesn't. "And a full tribe of Indians we found there, collecting and drying berries. I never saw so many and so many kinds of berries in all my life. Chequoss was between Mount Adams and Mount St. Helens, both close aboard. We stayed some 3 days, fixing packs, etc., and letting the animals fill up with grass, which was in great abundance." So Dr. Cooper was busy when they were up there at Chequoss. He was collecting specimens. So see, these are some of the official specimens he listed that he collected while he was there. 2 frogs, a chipmunk, a mouse. He also collected a squirrel. McClellan actually shot a marten while he was up there and sent the fur back to Fort Vancouver. And all of the expedition members talk about the abundant huckleberries that were up here. This is something in George Gibbs' final report. He said they, meaning the Klickitat Indians, were at this time feasting on strawberries and the mountain whortleberry, which is a word for huckleberry, which covered the hills around. So the expedition members were free to forage for food while they were up there, and so they definitely foraged for berries. And also grouse. Dr. Cooper wrote in his journal that the grouse almost supplied our mess with provision while they were there. Now, that's a lot of grouse for 68 men. So they met with local Klickitat Indians while they were camped there. And George Gibbs wrote in his final report that there were 138 Klickitat Indians camped near them at Chequoss, and that they were in 20 lodges. And he said they were engaged in picking and drying huckleberries. They were using the sweat lodge as a means of purification because someone had just died of smallpox, and that they were also racing horses. And Duncan, who was sort of the unofficial artist of McClellan's expedition, he painted this beautiful watercolor when they were there at Chequoss. And this is the cedar bark baskets that the Klickitat Indians were using to gather huckleberries. It's a folded bark basket, a single piece of bark that gets folded and sewn up the sides. And this is in the Smithsonian archives today. So, and a drama played out while they were there at Chequoss. So the Yakima chief Skloom, now this is Kamiakin's brother, he's a chief in his own right, and he's over in the central Yakima Valley. He got wind of this expedition from the Yakima Valley, and he sent 20 warriors to intercept the expedition at Chequoss. And they spread the rumor amongst the Klickitat Indians who were living there that the expedition was out to basically steal the horses, cattle, and land of the Yakimas and kill them if they resisted. McClellan was furious when he heard this, and he just wanted to get to the bottom of it. So he's dashing off letters right and left, sending them back to Fort Vancouver, wanting to know, how did this happen? This is going to jeopardize my entire expedition. So it's interesting because he ended up meeting with Skloom later when he got to the Natchez, and Skloom admitted to him that he made the story up because he was just trying to, fish around and find out what were these people up to. But this story in itself is amazing when you think of how in 1853, Skloom even heard about the expedition, and also how he managed to send 20 Yakima warriors and intercept them at a place on the crest of the Cascade Range. So it really displays that to the native people, this land was very familiar, a very familiar landscape, even if to the expedition it was terra incognito. So finding Chequoss on the ground was a challenge. The passing of 150 years brings changes to a landscape, particularly one where fire has been actively suppressed. So these areas described as being open grass and whatever were now covered in, basically a mature forest. But using some of the notebooks from the expedition, Dr. Cooper's map, this is Minter's courses and distances, you can pick certain landmarks out along the way. So we know that they passed by what we now know today as the Indian Racetrack, or Kalamat. Minter wrote in his journal, at 11:30, we struck a small lake and a little plain, an Indian lodge near the lake. And then McClellan also wrote, we reached a small plateau in the midst of which was a small pond, the grass nearly eaten off by Indian horses. Now, again, he's obsessed with grass, so that's why he's always mentioning grass. And then at 12 o'clock, Minter writes, we struck a little prairie. So this is another prairie past Racetrack, where there was a caballero of Indian horses, about 30 head, some of which were very good. This is a place we believe Yakima elders have identified for us as Chequoss. And it's a place where we found abundant evidence of huckleberry processing, huckleberry drying. There's actually a horse race track here as well. But this was not the expedition's Chequoss because they kept going. And at 12:40, they arrived in their camp. And Minter writes that there were Klickitat Indians camped near them there, and that there were 2 wells and a small lake. Oh, maybe not. Now, this reference to wells is a really interesting one because the only water sources in this area are from very shallow rain-fed ponds. And the horses, so the livestock, had to drink from these. And this is both the native people's horses and the expedition's horses. And so to get clean drinking water, the native people had devised this method of digging these shallow wells along the edges of the lakes so that they would barricade off so that the horses couldn't get in them so they could have clean drinking water. And McClellan wrote, when they got to camp, the grass is excellent here. There are 2 ponds of water for the animals and a well for drinking purposes. Some 20 lodges of Indians in the vicinity. In the morning, we ascended a hill east of camp. I had a fine view of the surrounding country. So when you look at his notebook, this is his second notebook, which is probably the draft. He gives a number. He ascends this hill east of camp, and he gives a number of compass readings to different places and to most of the snow peaks. So he's giving azimuths to Mount Adams, Mount Hood, Mount St. Helens, Mount Rainier. You can see he sketched Mount Adams there, did a little doodle of Mount Adams. And he also gives an azimuth to camp, my tent. Well, there you go. You would think you could just walk there. Well, if only it were that simple, because using the expedition's compass readings was not straightforward in any way. So they took 2 types of compasses with them. They took a surveyor's compass, which produces bearings like in a quadrant. So it'd be like north 50 degrees east. And those readings, when they used that compass, were very accurate. You had to adjust for declination, but they were very accurate. The readings with the Schmalkalder compass, which is what you see here, this produces azimuth, so on 0 to 360 degrees. And you look at these and you're just like, they're wrong. They're like really, really wrong. And if you notice, like just as an example, he gives a reading to Mount Rainier as 176 degrees. That's due south. Well, if you think about it, Rainier is due north. So it's clear, and they're not even that straightforward. That just happens to be a really straightforward one. And so because these readings were pretty easy to replicate, because he's looking at the snow peaks, it was easy to go up there and take actual readings and compare them to this. And what I found is they're basically upside down and backwards. So if you turn them up, flip them over, they're correct. So again, we look at the kind of compass that he's using. This is a Schmalkalder compass. This was considered an innovation. It wasn't new at the time, it had been around, but it was considered a state-of-the-art compass for surveying. And it was considered extremely accurate because they used a prism. So the person sighted through a prism and then through the sight. So they didn't have, and the compass reading was reflected in the prism, and they didn't have to look down at the face of the compass. And because it's reflected in the prism, the actual compass card is inverted. So, and if I know it's hard probably for you to see this, but it's basically inverted. It shows north as 180 degrees. So all I can think is they either broke the prism and didn't have it, so they're using this compass card straight up, or the person who's taking the readings, which is one of those assistants that McClellan hired to bring with him, didn't know how to use it. But the weirdest part about it is they never mention it. And this is not just at Chequoss. This is the entire expedition, because I went back and checked all of their azimuths. They're all upside down and backwards. And they never say anything about it. They never say, oh, we got to fix these when we get back. But so anyway, but once you correct those, once you turn them upside down, they're very accurate. And so we were able to use those compass readings. And in the area where they indicated, we did find 2 well features. We found several bark peeled trees. So in 1999, and you can get the idea here that this is research that I should have written up a long, long time ago and didn't. But in 1999, we organized a Passport in Time project, which is a Forest Service type of project where we would bring volunteers in to help us do our work out here. We've done many of these over the years, and several of the people who were part of this Passport in Time crew were OAS members at the time. So we brought this group in, and we spent, I think, about 4 days surveying a very, very large area with metal detectors, trying to find some physical remains of the camp. And we ended up finding a rock feature and 33 artifacts of mostly of metal, and we did find a few artifacts of glass and ceramic. So this is revisiting the site a few years ago. We're fairly confident, based on the compass readings, based on Minter's notebooks with courses and distances, that we found their camp. We know we found their camp. The artifacts that we found, however, are very generic, very difficult to date. They're broadly typical of artifacts you would find from the, throughout the mid to late 19th century. But still, when you look at the archival record, you get a few clues. So here's 3 of the artifacts that we found there. A tinned iron plate. We found fragments, several fragments of a tinned iron cup that had a riveted handle, and a folding knife. So the cup in particular, here's more of the fragments. It's kind of flattened. It's identical in style to a type of cup that was called a mix cup. This was manufactured by the GI Mix and Company in Connecticut, and it was purchased by the Army in quantity during the 1850s and the 1860s, particularly during the Civil War. This is considered one of these prize cups for Civil War collectors to find. And if you look at McClellan's journal for the day they left Chequoss, which was August 11th, 1853, he wrote, "The doctor lost his horse today, Crowley his kit and cartridge box." So the doctor's horse was found later that evening, but Private Crowley's kit was not. And if his kit does indeed refer to his eating utensils, that would have been a very sore loss. So we also found 2 halves of a pair of sort of Victorian style scissors. This is not the average sort of thing you find in a sheep camp out in the forest. They're fairly large. They'd be classified as shears. They were broken. 1 half of them was broken. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier. If you look at the detailed records that the expedition had of items that they purchased 4 pairs of scissors or shears in New York and had shipped. And these were likely haircutting scissors because, again, the Army had strict regulations for officers that they had to keep their hair and beards trimmed at that time. We found a little hand-forged spike that had a screwdriver-like base. It had been hammered into a little screwdriver. This was found near the rock feature that we think might represent a forge. Again, I'd mentioned earlier that they lost 25 screwdrivers for their rifles. And they would have looked something like the images you see here. They came in various shapes and sizes, but this was an example of what one type looked like. So, you can imagine that they could have tried to replicate making a screwdriver while they were there. Some of the other items that we found, a section of twisted link iron chain. It's a type of chain that will lay flat. It was often used to tie down loads. It was used for a lot of purposes with respect to mules, like for mule harnesses or harnesses where you took the animals to water. And we found a cut nail. And interestingly enough, when McClellan made it to Natchez a little bit later and he was trying to resupply, he ordered 10 pounds of nails. So obviously they were using nails for something. And then a kind of fragments of a sardine style can, heavily soldered. In fact, the only thing that's left of it is solder. And this type of canned food would have been available at Fort Vancouver for purchase. They had canned fish and canned meat there for sale. It would have been very early in the canning process, and it would have been very expensive. So the average soldier couldn't have afforded it, but the officers could have afforded it and could certainly have brought something like that with them. The rock feature, it's kind of interesting. It's made of very large rocks. They look like they've been dispersed in one direction, and we did find charcoal with, we put cores into the one end of it and found charcoal there. So it is possible that this was a forge. This is where we found that hand-forged spike. It's an area that was very, very compacted. No trees were growing there. But again, it would take a little more work there to really verify what this could have been. I also raised the possibility it could have been a bread oven because they did have a flour ration with them. But yeah, again, it would take a little more work to figure that out. So when we think about the importance of this place, what we found here, why it matters, it's important to remember that George McClellan and George Gibbs weren't the only important people who were there at Chequoss in August of 1853. This was the summer residence of the Klickitat chief, Toitooks, and both McClellan and Gibbs wrote on several occasions over the course of the time they spent there of meeting with Toitooks. And McClellan wrote at one point, had a talk with Toitooks in the evening. He is a very old man and chief of the Klickitats. Well, in spite of his being a very old man, he went on to play an important role in the Yakima War 3 years later. He met with Colonel Wright in 1856. He was instrumental in convincing the different bands of the Klickitat to come into the White Salmon Reservation to try to avoid conflict. And his son, the man who's pictured right here, Timox Toitooks, or Jake Hunt Sr., might have been there at Chequoss in 1853. He would have been a young man at the time. He too would go on to play an important role in the Yakima War in a different way. He was reportedly part of the group that actually attacked the Cascades in 1856. He lived a very long life as well, died, probably, close to 100 years old in the Usum area along the White Salmon River. Now, his children, in turn, were very well known to anthropologists in the 1920s and 1930s. His son, Joe Hunt, was Melville Jacobs' primary Klickitat informant for his Northwest Sahaptin text, his study that he did on language. His daughter, Lucy Hunt Quemps, was Vern Ray's Klickitat consultant for native villages and groupings of the Columbia Basin. And his youngest son, Jake Hunt Jr., founded the Feather Religion around 1900, and much has been written about that by anthropologists. So when George Gibbs wrote about Chequoss in 1865, and he made a kind of tongue-in-cheek comparison of the gatherings there to the ancient Christian councils at Nicaea. He was really trying to say that this was an important gathering place for people. So perhaps in our search for Chequoss, the artifacts that we found there aren't nearly as important as the stories that this landscape contains. So, thank you. Hey, yeah, if anyone has questions. Yes.
Also, it had a lot of found artifacts from the logging operations in the 19th century in that same area. You find artifacts related to that in their camp.
Not there, no, because they're up at they're in the wilderness. They're up at the crest of the Cascade Range. So this is up in the mountains, way up high.
Any other, okay, we got a question up here.
How many miles a day could they travel?
It varied a little bit, but their average was about 5 miles a day. So really, really slow going. Yeah. And when you think about it, they're just, well, sorry, it's just a huge group of people, and the pack animals and the packs and everything else. It was very cumbersome.
Did they say what size Dutch ovens they took?
They did not. They just labeled them as Dutch ovens. So I don't know how big they were. Is there a difference in size of them?
Yeah, there's 6-inch, 8-inch, 10-inch, 12 inches. Silverware reenacting usually uses 12-inch ones. A 12-inch one could easily feed 8 people.
Okay, so maybe the Dutch ovens could have been enough for the entire party. Yeah, and it's interesting with the baking soda too, because he did order quite a bit of baking soda, and I'm thinking they were somehow using this with their flour ration, because I don't know what else they're doing with their flour ration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In a raw, you use the Dutch oven, it's like underneath. You
Right.
don't need a stone oven to make bread. You can make bread in a Dutch oven.
Right. No, yeah, no, I'm aware of that. It's just, yeah.
Oh, can you talk about McClellan's cannon?
Oh, you're just being silly. No, on the Gifford Pinchot National Forest, there is a legend associated with McClellan. There's actually many legends associated with McClellan, but one is that he lost a cannon somewhere there on the forest, and that over time people have claimed to have seen it. Sheep herders saw it, back in the day, but basically, they're very clear with what they purchased. They're very clear with what they brought with them. They didn't bring a cannon with them, even though they had a lot of other things. There was no cannon, so sorry.
It looked like we had a question in the chat about, sorry, whether or not McClellan's expedition was well known at the time. Let's see here. Sorry.
Oh.
I got a lot of, we can't hear you, but that was earlier. Okay. Was McClellan's work on the expeditions well known at the time?
Well, it was certainly well known, I would say, on the East Coast. On the West Coast, I'm not so sure. He was a pretty well-known person within the military at the time. He had served with distinction in the Mexican War, and so he was a very well-known officer. But yeah, I don't know whether his work would have been well-known here, because it took so many years for the railroads to ever actually get built. They wrote their reports, they published their reports, and their intent was that this transcontinental railroad would get built. Well, it didn't get built for another 20 years. So yeah, probably not.
And then another one on the chat, looks like, has there been an effort to survey more of the camps if the compass readings are that accurate to pinpoint their location?
Well, the interesting thing is that this camp at Chequoss is a little bit unique in that it had these nearby peaks that they climbed up to and that they took compass readings from. That's not the case at their other camps. They're basically working their way towards the crest of the Cascade Range, and then they go back down. Now, they do have the courses and distances of Minters, and I have traced those all out on pieces of paper and laid them down on maps. And so, yes, I do think that if you really spent a lot of time with his courses and distances, so you need to have a point to start from to be able to make them make sense. So you would have to start at one of their known camps and then work your way one way or another from there. So, so to answer the question, we have not, but it wouldn't be quite the same because at Chequoss, they had peaks that they took readings to their tent from.
All right, we got a question here.
Did they go around, like around Mount St. Helens and Mount Adams? They try to climb up, at least part way up there, or use for readings?
No, they did not. They avoided, one of the choices for their routes took them up by St. Helens, but they opted not to go that way. So they instead went up the Lewis River. And then they headed up towards what we now call the Indian Heaven area. And they did not go anywhere near the summit of Mount Adams. They went through Trout Lake and then they went around to Glenwood. So they would have been going kind of around, completely around the bottom. But no indication that they made any attempt. But at the same time, or the next year, 1854, another thing that McClellan was responsible for, and this is a completely other story, but besides this survey, he was given this other odd job of surveying the wagon road from Fort Walla Walla to Fort Steilacoom, I guess. And this would have been up the Natchez wagon road for immigrants. And he ended up hiring people to do it. And he hired some very well-known people to do it. And those people climbed Mount Adams in 1854 from the north side. So that's kind of an interesting thing that when people say, who's the first, non-native person to try to ascend Mount Adams, it was 3 or 4 men from this group of road builders who were building the immigrant road up the Natchez under McClellan's direction.
Did they only encounter members of the Klickitat band at Chequoss, or were there other Yakima Nation bands there?
Well, the Klickitats were the people who were there right then, but Skloom did send 20 Yakima men over to meet with them, and they were clearly very familiar with the area. So undoubtedly, they also had camps in the area. Now, for them to have even found them is, a fairly amazing thing to ponder. So yes, I believe that the Yakima had other camps in the area, perhaps not that particular one.
Was the expedition from west to east?
Yes, it was. And so, McClellan's was, then Isaac Stevens is heading west from St. Paul, Minnesota, and he actually met with McClellan. I think they met at Fort Colville, I'm pretty sure. It's where they finally met. Because McClellan's job was considered to be much harder because he was having to explore all of the Cascade Passes.
All right, any more questions online or here at OMSI? All right, so there's about 20 more screwdrivers to find is what I'm looking at.
I would say there are, yeah.
Yeah.
And what happened to that Colt's revolver?
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming here and giving us this amazing presentation. I remember seeing Civil War reenactments all the time. Those pictures of those A-frame tents just give me flashbacks.
Yes, so I'm gonna grab my drive in here.
Perfect. And everybody, oh yeah, perfect. Our next meeting is gonna be Larry Lohendorf. It's not gonna be on a Tuesday, that's election night. November 6th is the day. Wednesday will be our next meeting at OMSI. Until then, thank you. Have a great night. I've got one for you as well. Yes, yeah, sorry.